Let's talk about Bardo states from the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. The word Bardo in Tibetan literally just means like in between. So a Bardo state is a state in between one thing and another, and I'll describe briefly in this video all the different Bardo states that we're going to talk about in the course. More colloquially, Bardo often is used to refer to the state in between the end of the death process and the beginning of the rebirth process. So even though there are many different types of Bardos, sometimes people will just say, you know, X is in the Bardo, they passed away. Sometimes it takes on an even more colloquial meaning where people really just mean I was in between one thing and another. For instance, you could talk about that summer in between the end of high school and the beginning of college as a Bardo state. In this course, we're going to talk about four main Bardo states: the Bardo of life, the Bardo of death, the Bardo of clear light, and the Bardo of becoming. The first Bardo we'll talk about in this course is the Bardo of life, and that begins at the moment that you're born, and it ends at the moment when your death process begins, which we'll talk about next in the Bardo of death. So the Bardo of life, really, even though we tend to think of this life as kind of one stable, steady state that we're in, thinking of it as a Bardo helps us to remember that it's the time in between when we were born and when we're going to die. And that time, we don't know when it ends. Lots of different things happen within that time, but it's really only an in-between state, just like everything else. So the Bardo of life covers everything from our birth, our childhood, adulthood, having kids, having a career, whatever we do, old age. So all of that is contained within the Bardo of life, making it a really big Bardo. Within the Bardo of life, there are two Bardo states that sometimes people talk about separately as well. And the first one is the Bardo of dream, which is relatively simple. When we fall asleep and we begin to dream, that opens up this space of the Bardo of dream. And we're basically creating an entire setting in our minds. So our body in that dream, whoever we're with, the environment that's around us, we create all of that when we begin to dream. And then when we end that dream, it all just dissolves. So that's the Bardo of dream. The Bardo of meditation is the other state that people sometimes will talk about within the Bardo of this life. So the Bardo of meditation begins when we're in a meditative state and our ordinary mind kind of just falls away for a moment, and then we have a very different type of experience that lasts until that ordinary mind kind of comes back together again. So that Bardo of meditation doesn't necessarily mean like if I sit down in the morning and I'm trying to do some basic meditation and my mind is going everywhere. That's not necessarily what the Bardo of meditation is talking about. The reason it's considered a different Bardo is because that mental state of not having your ordinary mind active is very different. The next Bardo that we're going to talk about is the Bardo of death. And this one begins when the energies that support your life begin to break down in your body. So sometimes people will say like, oh, we're dying every day. And it's true that every day we're using up, you know, some of our lifespan. But what this Bardo of death is really talking about is that at the end of our life, there comes a time, according to Tibetan Buddhism, our mind and our body are both sustained by the circulation of energy. And according to this model of death, there comes a time when that energy begins not to flow properly anymore, not to flow the way that it does as we're alive. There are said to be 5 elements in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and each of these 5 elements supports one of the 5 senses. It's very complicated, but for our purposes, as those elements and the energies that carry the flow of those elements through our body and our mind begin to not flow anymore, we begin to lose, for instance, the senses. So various books will describe the order in which we lose our 5 senses. There comes a point at which we can't see, a point at which we can't hear, and it's because, according to this tradition, the energies, the flow of energy that supports each of those 5 senses, they're kind of just dissolving one by one. So we lose the fire element, the water element, the earth element, and we lose our capacities to engage with the outside world. And at a certain point, we even lose our capacity for thought. And all of this is part of the process of really everything we are, everything we are familiar with breaking down, being stripped away. And this is said to be, for kind of obvious sounding reasons, a pretty scary process if you're not familiar with the teachings on it and if you don't know that these things can happen during the death process. I'm not saying they happen or they don't happen. You can choose to believe whatever you want. These are just traditional presentations of the teachings on the death process. If you've heard of the Bardo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's designed to be read to somebody as they're going through this process, because the idea is they would have studied those teachings during their lifetime, and then as they come to die, they're being reminded of what's happening so that they don't get freaked out, so that they're able to use that transition process as part of their spiritual practice. So the Bardo of death stops at the moment when the energy circulating in the body has fully stopped. So you might call that the moment of separation, really, between the mind and the body. The body is now dead. As soon as, in a way, you could say our old mind and our old body have completely fallen away, that's when the next Bardo begins. And this is a really important Bardo in the teachings about this transition. This is the Bardo of clear light. And if you think of the Bardo of death as the process of all of our identity, all of our ability to interact with the world falling away, the Bardo of clear light is the experience of what's left. So in the Tibetan Buddhist teachings, they talk about this as the time when all of us are going to experience our own Buddha nature. Whether we've ever practiced or studied or anything, everybody experiences what Buddhism calls Buddha nature, because that's what we really, really are underneath all these different layers. And the thing is, this state of being completely stripped down is what many of us in various traditions practice an entire lifetime to experience in our ordinary life. And according to this tradition, this happens naturally at the time of death. So this moment in the death process is a really huge moment of opportunity. And as we talk in this course about transitions and transformations, this moment after everything is kind of stripped away is also a huge moment of opportunity for us in our ordinary lives as we go through transitions and transformations. According to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, if we've really trained to recognize the nature of our mind, to recognize the nature of reality, then when we have this opportunity in the Bardo of clear light, we may recognize it. We may be able to rest in that and to feel like we're just coming home to reality itself. If we haven't, we're still going to experience it, but again, according to these teachings, it may pass very briefly. We may not even realize that's our own true nature. So that's a lot of the point of practice, is to realize what our nature is, and then at the time of death, we have a perfect opportunity to practice it. After the Bardo of clear light comes what we often call the Bardo. So I'll just call it the Bardo. So this period is after the end of the moment, or longer than a moment, however long we were able to rest with that clear light. After that ends, it's sort of like waking up. There's a moment toward the end of the death process that's described as like blacking out. And then we would obviously have some experience during the Bardo of clear light, but our ordinary mind is not active then. So our ordinary mind kind of comes back online. It may not be completely ordinary, but like a non-Buddha nature form of mind comes back online during the Bardo, when we're in between the end of the Bardo of clear light and we haven't yet begun to take on a new form. So this time, this in-between time, is a really important one also for practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, because it's said that during this time, your mind is very sensitive. It's very subtle. So it's a great time for practice. The thing is, this time is also said to be a time when if your mind is not stable, it just kind of gets blown around everywhere by emotions and feelings. And they say in the Tibetan tradition that in this in-between state, we have a very subtle body. We're a Bardo being. And anywhere we think of, we just immediately go there. So you can see this is a state in which the body is no longer, or the mind is no longer kind of held in place, so to speak, by the body. Right now, our mind may be kind of flighty, but according to this tradition, there's a limit of how scattered it can be, because we have this physical body to contain and kind of ground the mind. So they're saying that in this in-between state, you actually don't have that anymore. So if you're able to use it for practice, you can have a lot of transformation during this time. But if you're not, you can end up just getting blown around and just being very discombobulated, and it doesn't sound like a particularly pleasant experience. As we come toward the end of the Bardo, we begin to be attracted toward our next lifetime. So if, for instance, we're going to be a human, we might see a human couple and feel just drawn to them. There's some sort of Freudian stuff in the Tibetan tradition about if you're a male, you'll be attracted to your future mother, and if you're a female, you'll be attracted to your future father, or if you're going to be male or female. I don't know if Bardo beings have gender or how that works. But anyway, you're not just attracted to that couple, you're actually attracted to the type of life form that you're going to be next. So if I've cultivated some kind of karma in this lifetime that makes me drawn toward just simple pleasures, not having to think very much, maybe I'll end up being drawn into an animal body. That's the Tibetan theory. So maybe I'll look at dogs and think like, oh yeah, that looks really comfortable, and just be drawn into that next lifetime as a dog. So that leads us into the Bardo of becoming. And this is really the Bardo in between the time when we've seen our future parents, we've been attracted to them, we've been drawn to them, and according to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, at the moment of conception, we're sort of drawn into that new little embryo. And from there on, we're in the Bardo of becoming. So we're no longer a Bardo being. We now have the beginnings of a physical body again. And again, according to this system, it's really that mind stream that we're bringing from our previous life that becomes intertwined with the physical body and helps to drive the development, not just of the fetus, but then once we're born, it'll help to drive our psychosocial development as well. So in this Bardo of becoming, we the mind of our previous life have now kind of gotten dropped into a new body. The new body is developing. We are bringing with us from our previous life the strong inclinations that we cultivated during that lifetime. So if you've heard of karma, I'm sure you're familiar with this idea that it's almost like ripples in water. You know, if you've dropped a pebble into the pond in your previous lifetime, those ripples keep on going. We may not be able to see that pebble anymore, but the ripples will be with us for a while to come. That's what the theory of karma says. Again, you can believe it, don't believe it, whatever makes sense to you. The main thing to know about this Bardo of becoming is that we're not yet the organism that we're going to be. But we're not a Bardo being. We're something in development. And I want to talk about that when we come to the fourth week and talk about this period during which something new is taking form, but it's not quite formed yet. So those are some very brief descriptions of the four main Bardo states that I want to talk about in this course. And we'll get into each of them in a little bit more detail as we go through these 4 weeks. And there are some really excellent resources on Bardo states, so you'll find links to some of those in the resources section of the intro unit to this course. So thank you very much, and I look forward to exploring these Bardos with you in more depth as we go through the course.